Good. We got 5 minutes, it says. I think it's wrong. Anyway, good morning, everybody. Ladies, welcome back. It's empty and quiet without you. Had to pick on Caitlin the entire class last week because y'all weren't here. Thank you for being here. This class, we are rolling through it. We have gone through Jonah already, gone through Amos already. We're now on to Hosea. It's going to be our next text. The same king, Jeroboam II, is in control of the northern empire of Israel, nor the kingdom of Israel. And they are still being warned about how bad things are going. Things have not improved, and they will not improve historically. Before we get into the actual text, do we have anything we need to address about this class? Is the speed going at a pace that you're comfortable with? Is it too slow? Is it too fast? Okay, all right. That's the pace I like, is to go through the text and have some commentary as we go through it. I don't like being a part of a class that takes forever because I just feel like it drags on and I miss the point and we redundificate. That's a word I learned in Tennessee. You say the same thing over and over again. I had an elder one time after I was done preaching, and I preached for 40, 45 minutes, something like that, way too long. And he goes, well, you preached too long. I go, yeah, I know. And he goes, well, you're redundificating. I'm like, what word is that? And he goes, you're saying the same thing, but you're repeating yourself over and over again. I go, well, it's good feedback. I appreciate that. So I don't like having a class that's kind of, that kind of repetitive way. At the same time, I don't want to go through it so quickly we miss the point. So when we're done with a book, I'd like for you to have kind of a bird's eye view of what the whole point of the book was. There's little nuances that are scattered in there. Hosea is going to be one of those books that's a little bit longer. It's the same length, basically, as Amos in a way. Same main thrust behind it, but there are some details that are different in Hosea than they are in Amos. So we'll talk about those when we get to them. Before we get into the text, what I want to do is play the Bible Project video about this book. And for me, I'm a very visual person, so it helps me to kind of see an image of what the book's all about. I'm sure you did when I was gone a couple weeks ago, but I want to just kind of revisit it. It's a quick little video just to kind of give you an idea of how there's three main sections, and then when that's done, we'll go right into the text. Okay? You don't have a choice, so you have to sit through it. So, just say okay. All right, here we go. You can bring some.
The book of the prophet Hosea. Hosea lived in the northern kingdom of Israel, which he sometimes calls Ephraim or Jacob, about 200 years after they had broken off from southern Judah. Remember the story from 1 Kings. Hosea was called to speak on God's behalf during the reign of one of Israel's worst kings, Jeroboam II. The nation was descending into chaos, and in the year 722, the big bad Assyrian Empire swooped in and decimated Israel. Again, see the story in 2 Kings. And Hosea had seen all of this coming. The book is a collection of some 25 years of his preaching and writing. It's almost all poetry. And this whole collection has been designed to have three main sections. Let's just dive in and you'll see how it works. The opening part tells the story of Hosea's broken marriage to a woman named Gomer, who commits adultery. Now, it's not totally clear whether Gomer slept around with other men before or only after they got married, but they did have 3 children together and things fell apart. The important point is that God tells Hosea that despite Gomer's unfaithfulness, he is to go find her, to pay off her debts to her lovers, and to commit his love and faithfulness to her once again. And then God says that all of this, the broken and repaired marriage, the children, it's all a prophetic symbol telling the story of God's relationship to Israel. So God has been like a faithful husband to Israel. He rescued them out of slavery. He brought them to Mount Sinai, where he entered into a covenant with them. He asked them to be faithful faithful to him alone. But then he brought Israel into the promised land, and they took all the abundance that he gave them, and they dedicated it to the worship of the Canaanite god Baal. And so God has a legitimate reason. He could end the covenant and divorce Israel, and he thinks about doing so, but instead, he says that he's going to pursue Israel again and renew his covenant with them. And he says why? It's purely because of his own love, compassion, and faithfulness. Hosea then spells out what all this means. He says the consequences for Israel's rebellion will be imminent defeat by other nations and exile. But there's hope for future restoration. One day Israel will once again repent and come back to worship their God. And Hosea says he will place over them a new messianic king from the line of David who will bring God's blessing. And so this opening section introduces all the main ideas of the book. Israel has rebelled, and God's going to bring severe consequences, but God's own covenant love and mercy are more powerful than Israel's sin. And so in the remaining sections of the book, Hosea's poetry explores these themes in more depth. So there are two collections. Southern Judah. Remember the story from 1 Kings. Hosea was called to speak on God's behalf during the reign of one of Israel's worst kings, Jeroboam II. The nation was descending into chaos, and in the year 722, the big bad Assyrian Empire swooped in and decimated Israel. Again, see the story in 2 Kings. And Hosea had seen all of this coming. The book is a collection of some 25 years of his preaching and writing. It's almost all poetry. And this whole collection has been designed to have three main sections. Let's just dive in and you'll see how it works. The opening part tells the story of Hosea's broken marriage to a woman named Gomer, who commits adultery. Now, it's not totally clear whether Gomer slept around with other men before or only after they got married, but they did have 3 children together and things fell apart. The important point is that God tells Hosea that despite Gomer's unfaithfulness, he is to go find her, to pay off her debts to her lovers, and to commit his love and faithfulness to her once again. And then God says that all of this, the broken and repaired marriage, the children, it's all a prophetic symbol, telling the story of God's relationship to Israel. So God has been like a faithful husband to Israel. He rescued them out of slavery. He brought them to Mount Sinai, where he entered into a covenant with them. He asked them to be faithful to him alone. But then he brought Israel into the promised land, and they took all the abundance that he gave them, and they dedicated it to the worship of the Canaanite god Baal. And so God has a legitimate reason. He could end the covenant and divorce Israel, and he thinks about doing so, but instead, he says that he's going to pursue Israel again and renew his covenant with them. And he says why? It's purely because of his own love, compassion, and faithfulness. Hosea then spells out what all this means. He says the consequences for Israel's rebellion will be imminent defeat by other nations and exile. But there's hope for future restoration. One day Israel will once again repent and come back to worship their God. And Hosea says he will place over them a new messianic king from the line of David who will bring God's blessing. And so this opening section introduces all the main ideas of the book. Israel has rebelled, and God's going to bring severe consequences, but God's own covenant love and mercy are more powerful than Israel's sin. And so in the remaining sections of the book, Hosea's poetry explores these themes in more depth. So there are 2 collections of his accusations and warnings for Israel, and then each of these is concluded by a very hopeful poem about God's mercy and hope for the future. So chapters 4 through 10, Hosea explores the causes and effects of Israel's unfaithfulness. He says numerous times that Israel lacks all knowledge or understanding of God. The Hebrew word to know, which is yada, it's more than just intellectual activity. It describes personal relational knowledge. It's the difference between just knowing about someone and then actually knowing that someone. And God wants Israel to know him like that, in a relationship. He wants them to experience his love for them and become the kind of knowledge that transforms their hearts and lives so that they love him in return. And so this is why Hosea is constantly exposing the hypocrisy of Israel's worship. He constantly shows how they're breaking the 10 Commandments, how they're allowing grave injustice in their communities, and then they go to their sacred temples and they offer sacrifices to God like everything is just fine. But it's not fine. And not only because of their hypocrisy, but because they're worshiping all of these other gods too. He mentions many times their altars to Baal at the cities of Bethel and Gilgal. And not only have they given their allegiance to other gods, Hosea repeatedly accuses Israel for trusting in their political alliances with Egypt and Assyria. So instead of trusting God to protect them, they want to become like these nations and rely solely on military power. And God says it's all going to come crashing down on their heads, because in not too long, Assyria will turn on them and come to ravage their lands. In this other section of warning, Hosea gives an ancient Israelite history lesson to show how this family's been unfaithful from the beginning. So he alludes to the patriarch Jacob's lying and treachery. Remember Genesis 27 and 28. He alludes to Israel's rebellion in the wilderness. Remember the book of Numbers. He alludes to their appointment of the corrupt king Saul, who led the people into sin and disaster. Remember the stories in 1 Samuel. This is all Hosea's way of saying some things in this family never change. So what hope does Hosea have? Well, we know from chapter 3 that God's going to do something to save and restore his people. And that's what these two concluding chapters explore. Chapter 11 is beautiful. The poem depicts God as a loving father who raised his son Israel and then shared everything with him. But the son grew up and rebelled and turned on the father, taking advantage of his generosity. And so in this poem, God is emotionally torn apart. One moment he's angry, and naturally he says he's going to bring severe consequences. But the next moment he's heartbroken. And then he says that he's moved by his mercy and compassion, and he's going to forgive the son that he loves. He says, "How can I give you up, Ephraim? My heart churns inside of me. All my compassion is aroused." And so while God did allow Israel to be conquered by Assyria, face the consequences, that's not God's final word. There's still hope. And that's what the last chapter is about. Hosea calls Israel to repent and turn back to their God, but he knows that it won't last because it never has before. And God says that one day he will heal their waywardness and love them freely. God goes on to describe this new healed Israel as a lush tree that will grow deep roots and broad branches and offer shade and fruit to all of the nations. It's an image of God's promise to Abraham, how Israel was to become a blessing to the nations. And God's saying, if that's ever going to happen, it's going to require an act of God's grace and healing power to repair the deep brokenness and sinful selfishness of the human heart, so that God's people can receive his love and love him in return. This is what God promises to do. Now, after this poem concludes, we find the very last words of the book. They're like an appended note. They're likely from the author who collected Hosea's poetry and now wants to speak to you, the reader, for a second. And he says, who is wise and discerning to understand all of this? In other words, Hosea's poems. The ways of the Lord are right. The righteous walk in them, but the rebellious stumble in them. So the author wants you to know that Hosea's ancient poetry to northern Israel is not locked in the past. It reveals deep truths about God's character and purposes and human nature. And while God should and does bring his justice on human evil, his ultimate purpose, his heart, is to heal and to save his people. And that's what the book of Hosea is all about.
Okay. As I mentioned before, we're going to be reintroduced to all these people one day, and they're like, you got my name wrong for generations, but all right. So Hosea here, I think the big one's going to be the idea of his relationship with Gomer. God's going to use that as an image. I mean, obviously, God in this dynamic is being seen as a husband to the nation of Israel. In a similar way, we look into the New Testament, and that dynamic shifts a little bit, but the same kind of idea is used. How is God referred to in the New Testament?
Multiple ways, but it's a husband to the bride,
Okay.
which is the church.
So you have the groom, right? And then who's the bride? The church. So still God's people, just expanded beyond the physical nation, the boundary of Israel, right? Because I'm not sure any of us here are natively Israeli, so that would be a problem if we weren't a part of that family, right? So we have the idea of it being expanded. So the dynamic that we understand from Hosea's book about how God feels about his relationship with his people is still true in a different variant when it comes to our relationship with him. So it has meaning for us, obviously. And just beyond that, there are quotations from this book in the New Testament that if you don't know the book, it makes it much more complicated to understand the meaning behind it, right? And I think my favorite minor prophet, if I had to pick one, would be Joel, just because it's used as a quotation more than any other minor prophet in the New Testament. Acts 2, for example, Peter's whole point about what the day of Pentecost spiritually was the fulfillment of a prophecy from the book of Joel. So just keep in mind, this is why we're doing it, to get a deeper understanding of context used in our New Testament. So let's begin reading here. Chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So, kind of a housekeeping thing real quick. He's referring to the kings that were in charge during the time of his life in the southern tribe of Judah first, and then in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. So you've got the southern tribes and the northern tribes talked about here. He's giving you a time stamp of where he did his ministry. Verse 2, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go and take yourself a wife of whoredom. That's that clear enough? Okay, hopefully so. And have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. So we'll pause there. What's going on here? Okay, symbolism, right? He is drawing a parallel. It was not obvious, it would seem, from the people of Israel what they were doing by forsaking worshiping only the Lord, Yahweh, Jehovah, and going after other gods like Baal, which was a Canaanite god. They weren't seeing it as being a major spiritual problem. And one of the reasons we talked about in Amos was because they were so blessed. There was no combat, no conflict going on nationally, as far as they could tell. Things were being very prosperous and they were being blessed, and you had people that were in the upper class that were living quite well. And so things weren't looking bad yet. And yet God, through Amos, told him, I've sent you famine, I've sent you pestilence, I've sent you all these things to try to wake you up to the reality of what you're living through, but all the higher class people aren't getting the message yet. So he's saying, here's one way I might be able to get through to my people is you are going to be an object lesson. I want you, my prophet, Hosea, to go marry a prostitute and have children by this prostitute to draw a parallel through symbolism of what's going on in the nation. Poor prophet. I mean, talk about being a guy who's just trying to do the right thing, and then God tells you to go marry a prostitute to draw an image for the people. And it seems like it doesn't even work until we're reading it nowadays, right? So that's a call to be a prophet. Verse 3, so he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Now, let's pause there just for a quick comment. So we have her name, Gomer, right? Do we really need her name? Yeah? Okay, why? Obviously, because God said so, right? Okay, good default answer. Is there, okay? We have her name and we have who her daddy is, right? Why would that be significant in the text? Okay, is this a real person? It would seem to indicate it's a real person. It would seem like the people that would live during that day that would know who this guy was in some kind of way, at least be able to trace back, she is a legitimate real person. So that's important only because sometimes some people, when they look at certain stories or narratives from the Old Testament, they try to over-symbolize things maybe, in my estimation, and they would say, well, it's all just a story to kind of convey some kind of truth. And if it were just kind of like a parable, a throwaway story that has some meaning behind it, then you wouldn't have to have her name and who her dad was. And so just kind of indicating to us there's more here than just, a story to convey some truth. This was an actual event. The daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. So the son is born. Yep, Rachel. Sure.
Does her name mean anything significant in Hebrew?
Not that I recall.
Not her name or the kid's name?
Her name.
The kids' names are
The kids'
important.
names are.
Gomer. What's Gomer mean?
Hers.
Somebody cheat, look it up.
I know the kid.
Gomer means that's the one that God said you go marry.
Okay. It's a direct translation from the Hebrew. Thank you.
Pretty close.
Melissa, anything? You're cheating?
Yeah. It's, okay, whatever the Greek thing says means Gomer means complete, but I'm just.
Well, it's going to be Hebrew, not Greek.
Huh?
It's going to be Hebrew, not Greek.
That's what it said, Hebrew.
Hebrew,
Hebrew
okay.
says it means complete.
All right, so obviously I said that because if you look at the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, though that's a whole other conversation. How they got that translation is also very mysterious and mystified over the years. These 70 guys are locked up, and they're each working on a different portion of the books, and you have some overlap. And wouldn't you know it, these guys over here in isolation and these guys over here, they had the exact same Greek translation from the Hebrew. Wow, God must be performing a miracle. No, maybe, I guess, but there are still some errors in the Septuagint too. So.
In the regular dictionary,
Mm-hmm.
that it means, in military slang, is an in and out, student colleague, especially a trainee, informal, usually by doctors, is a troublesome patient.
If you say so. Okay, so probably not.
And Gomer is mentioned in other books of the Bible too, like other people's names have been Gomer in the Bible, Genesis, Chronicles, Ezra, so it's not the first time
Yep.
the name is in the Bible.
Of course it's in Ezra. Every name ever is in Ezra.
I mean Ezekiel, sorry, my bad.
Oh, never mind. Just kidding. Okay, so no, Rachel.
One more little thing.
All right.
It says, did not say go and marry Gomer.
Right.
It said go and marry a prostitute.
Mm-hmm.
He chose.
So,
I guess she was pretty.
Well, so she had a reputation because he knew who to go to.
Yeah. Well. All right. Moving on. I blame Rachel. Verse 4. Here's the son. The Lord said to call his name Jezreel, for in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. So you're making a point here, God, by naming him something that means something. And I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. So Israel is the north or south? North, okay. Verse 5, and on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So it's kind of like, hey, your firstborn son's here. Congratulations. Let's just make his name the thing that's going to ruin the north. It's kind of on the nose, right? Verse 6, she conceived again and bore a daughter, and the Lord said to him, call her name No Mercy, is the English translation. For I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow or by sword or by war or by horses or by horsemen. Let's pause there. Has the north been taken away at the time of the writing of this particular text? Okay. Who would they eventually be taken away by? Assyrians. Okay. Has the south been taken away into captivity yet? No. Who will take them away? Babylonians, right? So not the Assyrians. Do you recall what happened to save the south from Assyria? Anybody want to venture a guess?
take that and we'll take this.
No, that's not how that happened.
Maybe it had to do with,
Who's a guess?
although Judah wasn't faithful to the Lord, they were more faithful than the north.
They were more faithful than the north. How many good kings did the northern tribes have?
None.
0. Big old goose egg. How many did the south have?
Several.
About 5. Now, 2 of them we don't know a thing about besides their names, and then the Bible says, but they were good kings. And then we have 3 that we kind of know about. There's this guy named Hezekiah, and I have mixed feelings about Hezekiah because he seems like a bad king in some texts and seems like a good king in other texts. It kind of seems like God is trying to teach Hezekiah a lesson. And he was the king when the Assyrians were trying to invade and surround Jerusalem. We actually have in archaeology a tablet, a big old stone from Assyria, in which they said that they shut up the king Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. And that was true because they were completely surrounded and besieged by the Assyrian forces. However, if you might recall biblically, there's this story, this narrative about when they all went to sleep one night, an angel of the Lord went out and killed all of the troops. So they all literally woke up dead, which is a great way for the Bible to describe it. How do you wake up dead? Very carefully. That's a good answer. So that's how Hezekiah was the king in Jerusalem, being besieged by Assyria. One day they were all just dead, right? So that's how they escaped the Assyrian conquest and captivity. Now, Babylonians would take over the Assyrian Empire because they had a couple kings that weren't that great. Babylon took over, and then they went and besieged Jerusalem, and they got it, right? So that's a historical idea here. So when he's saying here in verse 6, I will not have mercy on the house of Israel, but I will have mercy on Judah. It's a little bit of the foreknowledge of God, right? God's outside of time and space, not bound by our constraints of this timeline thing that we're on. And so he's able to see in the future, okay, it's not going to happen to Judah the same way it's going to happen to Israel. They're not going to be saved at the end of verse 7. I will not save them by bow or by sword or by war or by horses or by horsemen. How does God save Judah? The angel of death comes and kills all of the people that were there. Multiple hundreds of thousands of troops around Jerusalem. That's how they're saved. So kind of a preview through Hosea. Verse 8. When she had weaned no mercy, that's her name once again, she conceived and bore a son, and the Lord said, call his name not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Well, talk about a Debbie Downer set of kids and their names. These poor children are going to grow up. My name's no mercy. My name is not my people. Like, okay, all right, if you say so, right? Because names usually mean something in the Bible, right? And these names are, of course, indications of God's reflection of his relationship with Israel as a nation. Now, for me, when I read verse 8 and verse 9, especially verse 9, that's really telling. Because if you'll recall, all God has ever wanted from Israel is that relationship where they shall be my people and I will be their God. That refrain is constantly repeated from the Garden of Eden onward. It even talks about it when it comes to the book of Revelation for us. And talking about that new Jerusalem that comes down from heaven. I mean, it concludes the very thought by saying, I will be its light. They won't have the need for the sun or the moon any longer because I'm there. They will be my people and I will be their God. So for him to get so far into this dynamic in verse 9 and say, call your daughter or call your son not my people, he's now ending that relationship. It's gone too far. Verse 10, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. So what's that all about? Redemption. The place where God says it's over. This relationship is dissolved. It will be in the future restored. Right? When does that happen? Okay, ultimately Jesus. It's also another possible answer. So the prophets, especially the minor prophets, are always kind of like option A, option B, also option C is yeah, both, right? So the historical place where they are restored as a physical nation would be looking at Ezra and Nehemiah, where they come back from captivity. They're gone for 70 years. You got 2 generations out there. They come back. They rebuild the temple in a way, restore the temple. They rebuild Jerusalem and its walls. And in a way, they are kind of brought back into the fold as people of God, right? And that goes from that period 400-ish years, kind of. There's a whole lot happens there, but about 400 years or so, in which you've got the restoration of the nation of Israel. You have Jews that know about Torah, they know about the law, and then they offer sacrifices and things are okay. And then in the first century, you got this guy named Jesus show up, and that's really when everything kind of shifts, right? So when you're looking for when does this take place, the answer usually is kind of Ezra and Nehemiah, but also kind of Jesus, right? Depending on what you mean. So keep that in mind. Okay. Verse 11. And the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head. And they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. So again, here is that kind of, yeah, we can see how that might fit when they're coming back to restore Jerusalem in Ezra and Nehemiah. We can also see a more fulfilled plan here when it comes to Jesus being the head of the church, the head of the body, right? Okay, questions, comments? It's chapter 1 of Hosea. Anything at all? Speak now, forever hold your peace. Which is, by the way, a thing I do not say during wedding ceremonies. Why in the world would you open up the conversation to anyone else? Chapter 2, verse 1. Say to your brothers, you are my people, and to your sisters, you have received mercy. So again, here's some play on words in the Hebrew, right? Verse 2, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. So who's speaking here in verses 1 and 2? Hosea is, okay? Doing it no doubt by inspiration of the Holy Spirit in some way, but he's also kind of reflecting this dynamic that God has with Israel, with his own dynamic that he has with not his wife, his Gomer, right? So are they, can of worms time, are they married in verse 2? Doesn't seem like it, right? What would break the covenant between Hosea and Gomer? Divorce, okay. Based on adultery? Okay. Verse 3. Lest I strip her naked and make her as the day she was born, meaning naked, and make her like a wilderness and make her like a parched land and kill her with thirst. It seems like he's a little bit upset. Right? Upon her children also I will have no mercy, because they are children of whoredom. Because their mother has played the whore, she who conceived them has acted shamefully. Because she said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my bread and my water and my wool and my flax and my oil and my drink. So how's Hosea doing? Not great. not happily married? You don't think so? Well, do you think Hosea is not feeding her, or you think that she is just...
Well, you got to look at it too as if it was Israel, and Israel's God was supplying them with everything they needed, but they went after false gods, who they said gave them these things.
Yeah, that's the meaning behind the story, right? Right, Caitlin? There you go. Because no doubt, if you've got someone who's in a marriage in which the wife has been unfaithful, they're going to come up with any kind of number of reasons as to why the husband's not good enough. I mean, I don't know if that's been true in your experience or not, but I know some friends that when their wives have been unfaithful, all kinds of stories about what the husband didn't do for them, but the boyfriends would have come up. And the same kind of thing I think is true here. Ultimately, the big picture here is whatever Hosea is experiencing is the same dynamic of what's happened with Israel as the wife and God as the husband. I mean, what was lacking in the promised land for the people? A land flowing with milk and honey. They had the vineyards that they had planted that were already producing fruit for them. They had orchards that were present. And they also had the people they were supposed to kill and utterly wipe out from that land, but they didn't do that. And so they became influences for generations on the people of Israel, because they said, well, you know, I know Jehovah God, Yahweh God, brought us to this promised land so many ever centuries ago, but, you know, I love this lady over here, and her God is Baal. If I want to make her happy, might as well worship Baal with her to make her happy, and I'll worship my God on my own time. That works for a little while, maybe, but God said that's not how that operates. Can't serve two masters. So what's happening in Israel during Hosea's day is that same dynamic. Sure, if you want to go worship Yahweh, Jehovah God, we have two altars set up here in the northern tribes. You can go to Bethel, where there's an altar for Jehovah, or you can go all the way up north and go to Dan. That's fine too. Whatever one you want to pick. But also, if you want to go worship Baal, he's over here too. So it's not just pick your God here. There's one God, and they should have known better. Same thing for Hosea. No, you don't have other lovers. You have a husband who provides for you, who is the person that you're in this dynamic relationship with. But he's a little bit upset in verse 5. Verse 6, therefore, I will hedge up her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her so that she cannot find her paths. He's going to try to make her wake up to the realization of what's going on in her life. Verse 7, she shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them. She shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it is better for me than now. It was better for me then than now. So again, he's trying to get his wife to come back to the relationship. God is trying to get Israel to come back to the God who saved them from Egypt. That's the whole lesson here.
And it also tells you that Hosea was providing what she needed because her life with him was better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Caitlin.
I know, but I'm just going by what that said, you know.
Well, you can't believe a liar. Did you know that? Okay. Somebody read verses 8 and 9 from the quiz.
She does not recognize that it is I who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the fresh oil. I lavished silver and gold on her, which they used for Baal. Therefore, I will take back my grain in its time, and my new wine in its season. I will take away my wool and linen, which were to cover her nakedness.
Okay, so this is again shifting from Hosea and Gomer to now being God, Israel in a more clear way. Because what he's saying is, I blessed Israel. Verse 9, I was the one that gave them grain, I gave them wine, I gave them oil, I gave them silver, I gave them gold, and they took those gifts and they offered it to Baal, a God who's not there. Mary?
Hosea?
complaining about Gomer, or is this God complaining about the Israelites?
Okay, do you remember the thing I said about answer A, answer B, answer C?
So it's both?
Yeah.
Okay,
All the above.
okay.
Okay. Verse 9, therefore I will take back my grain in its time, my wine in its season. I will take away my wool and my flax, which were used to cover her nakedness. Now there's a small nuance here that I'm sure don't have to remind you of. It's the idea that when the Assyrians would come, what was their practice to the higher class people? Take the ladies, especially the concubines or the wives of the king, put fish hooks through their cheeks, line them all up and drag them through the streets. That was done to their faces. What were they wearing when that was being done? Nothing. All their fine clothing, all their linens, all their wool, their flax were stripped off them to shame the high-class people of these other nations, including Israel, to show the people, if we can do this to the highest class people you have, what do you think we're going to do to you? That fear tactic was used here to demonstrate their power and their authority. And they felt that Babylon, of all people, I mean, what a strange empire Babylon is, but Assyrians are brutal. So, we're going to pause here for the day on that positive note and go on to verse 10, Lord willing, next week of chapter 2. Everything shifts at the end of chapter 3, so be looking forward to that shift. If you want to do some homework, I encourage you to do so. Go ahead and read through chapter 3 into chapter 4. Lord willing, by next week we'll pick this up. We will be dismissed now for about 18 minutes before worship begins. Thank you.